All right, FSW13. Welcome to the React Lifecycle module. Today we're going to be talking about the entire lifecycle of a React component. So we will see the full circle of life, as we talked about last week. And we're also going to, so we'll describe the three phases, the full circle of life. We're going to talk about two very important ones, constructor and render, very important methods that come as part of this life cycle. And then we'll talk about component did mount after that. So just real quick, these different methods are called component lifecycle hooks or lifecycle methods. And we'll talk about why they're called that in just a minute here. But let's take a look at what exactly the React lifecycle is. So when we're thinking in React, we're thinking about our entire web application being built up as smaller components, right? As small pieces of UI that are built together to make up our entire application. Every single component in React goes through the circle of life, goes through this React life cycle. We've talked about this briefly, and we've even looked at this confusing and intimidating image here. And by the end of today, you'll understand this a lot better, and you'll feel a lot more comfortable looking at something like this. So this was created by Dan Abramov. And it was created as a way to easily conceptualize a component's life cycle. Okay, so we break these up into three different phases. There is the render phase, pre-commit phase, and commit phase. So you can think of this as the circle of life. Your component is being born or is in the mounting phase. And then it's growing and updating and learning new things, getting new props, getting new state, and re-rendering on the virtual DOM and then updating the real DOM. And then the death phase, where our component is unmounting. I feel sad talking about that a little bit. RIP component. Okay, so as I said before, this can be a little intimidating and a little bit confusing at first glance. There are other charts that we can look at to get a better feel for the lifecycle flow. But I will warn you, we're going to look at a couple of them real quick, but I will warn you that this is the most up-to-date. So as of the new 16.4, as of React version 16.4, actually 16.3, or maybe it was 16.0, one of the latest versions brought in this new lifecycle here, lifecycle method, get drive state from props. The other charts that we're going to look at just to get a sense of the flow a little better haven't been updated to this latest version. So quick caveat there. But I still want to show you so you get a sense of the flow a little bit better. Okay, that's that one. Go away, Zoom tools. Go hide. There we go. Okay, so here's one way to look at the flow. This would be the mounting phase from this whole string all the way up to after component did mount. So your component starts, the constructor is invoked and runs. There's a lifecycle hook called component will mount, and then render, your render function, runs. So constructor and render we're very familiar with. We worked on with those the second half of last week. So those are both run inside the mounting phase. Then we have this cool hook or method called component.mount that runs after the first render. So the first render happens and basically says we have everything, we have the bare bones for what we need. Is there anything else we need before we jump into our other phases? And component.mount allows us to run those last couple things that we need to do. And we'll talk about at the end of this lesson what we would use this for. Okay, now we get into this part here is going to be the life of our component. So our component is up and running, and there's three things that could happen. We'll take the quickest route real quick. We'll unmount, we close the browser, we route it to a different area in our app that doesn't need this component anymore. We're hiding our component from the DOM, and so it's going to unmount. You know, whatever action that we take to kill our component runs through the unmounting phase. It hits this last hook, and then it's dead. Okay, so that's one thing that could happen as we're in our running phase here. Another thing that could happen is maybe we run set state. So let's say we run set state and our state on our component has changed. Well, we need to, as we've seen in our last few projects, we need the DOM to know about this change. And so React is going to go through a changing process. We gave it a name last week. It's the reconciliation process, right? It's going to check for what changed. It's going to build a new virtual DOM with those changes and push that to the real DOM. So don't worry about these right now, but it goes through a couple more functions, a couple more hooks, and then after our state changed, render is called again. So it's called on mounting, and it's called if our state changes. And then we get component.update, and once that is run, we jump back to our just kind of our static state where we're waiting for state or prop changes or unmounting. So that's two paths we can take. We can unmount, we can change state. If our component is a child component and receives new props, then it will go through this flow. So if props change, it's going to go through the exact same flow from here on down, but we add one extra hook. Component will receive props here. And this is the one that changed. This is the one that is not up to date. If we look back at this get derived state is the new version of, hide zoom tools. Just do that. Is the new version of component will receive props. There we go. So ignore that for now. This chart isn't up to date as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so we go through get derived state, and we go back through these other hooks. We re-render, and then we go through this hook, and we jump back up into the waiting phase. Okay, so that's the flow. Start goes through constructor, will mount, render, did mount. We wait for changes, or we wait to unmount. If a change happens, we go through this whole flow, this reconciliation process, and then it jumps back up to running. Now, it's important to note as well, and just briefly, because we're not really going to do much with it in this class, there is this should component update method where you can actually stop this whole process here. If you know that you don't want to re-render, then you can do some cool stuff inside here to stop this process and just jump back up into here. We won't go into use cases in this class, but if you want to, you can Google that and find out when this would be appropriate to do to hijack the reconciliation process and cut it off before it re-renders your component. This would be used for some extra optimization stuff that you can do if you want. Cool. So one more chart real fast, and then we'll talk about these different methods. Just one other quick way that we can look at this a little bit simpler. Again, component will receive props has been deprecated, and we are using get derived state from props. Okay, so initialization, mounting, you'll see render happening and all over the place here. Mounting, component did mount. If we're updating, updation, I like that, updation. If we're updating props, then actually let's look at this. So you'll notice that these are all the same, right? If we are updating props, we get this extra hook. But everything else, whether we're updating props or state, is the same. So we go through the reconciliation process. Again, we have the way to stop this process and not hit our render if we want, and then unmounting with component will unmount. Okay, so those are just a few different ways that we can look at the life cycle for a component. And I'll share these links. Well, I'll decide if I want to share these links since they're a little bit outdated. Oh, actually, nope, I'm not going to share these links because we have this really cool thing that was built. Where are you? Here we go. So this is a really cool project on GitHub right now that's live where, okay, we see this thing, we're starting to understand this chart a little bit better. And we can kind of see the flow. If we get new props, we're going to go through this flow. If we run set state, we're going to go through this flow. Force update is one that isn't on the other charts, but it is a thing that will kick off this flow as well. Now, we're going to uncheck this so that we don't show the less common life cycles. So now we're only showing the most common life cycle methods and the ones that we're actually going to talk about and worry about in this class. So what did we lose here? We lost get derived state from props. We lost should component update. We lost these. We lost get snapshot before update. So we lost a lot of this stuff that in most of your projects, you shouldn't, if you set things up correctly, you shouldn't really need. There are appropriate use cases for each of these. Since we don't know enough about the common life cycles, we're not going to go into those use cases, but they're easily, you can easily Google that. So if we uncheck this, now this is a lot less intimidating. Now we can look at this and say, okay, I'm mounting, my component is mounting, it's going to run through the constructor, it's going to run through the render, it's going to run through component did mount. If it gets new props or if I set state, don't worry about force update. We won't do that in this class. So if we set state or get new props to our component, we run through render, and we can use this function here, component did update. Okay, so This is the link that I'll send out to you. There we go. Second graph, but not the first one. I think you were probably talking about, oh, component wheel mount and yeah, so let's see. Nope, that's not it. Okay, so component wheel mount is one that we are losing. So this is, component wheel mount is probably a deprecated lifecycle hook. So yeah, again, there's some, these are kind of old, but I like that we can look at this and kind of get the feel for this component lifecycle a little bit better. But really good question. Thank you for that. Okay. I don't know why we are saying F here. Maybe I misspelled something. Okay, cool. So now that we've seen the flow and we can kind of conceptualize it a little bit in our head, let's talk about some of these specifically, and then we'll jump into some code using these components. So the constructor, what is the purpose of our constructor? By the way, when you click on these, you can see that they're links. They take you to the React docs for that thing that you clicked on. So that chart is really, really cool. Okay, so constructor. Let's talk about this lifecycle method. So constructor in a React component is called before it's mounted, and we need to call super props, otherwise this dot props will be undefined inside the constructor. So why do we have constructor? What is the purpose of constructor? A constructor is a way, one of the main reasons is to define the state for our application, or for our component, excuse me. So you can think of constructor's purpose as one that sets up the initial data for our component. So if we're building a class component, our constructor is what is going to define the data for our component and for other child components that are going to have that data passed down to them. It's also a way that we can bind this keyword to component to class properties. But so let's actually open up our React app here. So if we have, oh, these are all functions. If we're creating a class, and we need this to be a render. There we go. So let's say we have some function as a class property here, right? And we want this to do something like this dot set state. If we invoke this function, we are not going to have access to this keyword in the context of our class here. There's two ways to solve this. What we've done so far is set up, we've used this syntax which actually uses our fat arrow functions from ES6 to bind this keyword or bind this function with this keyword in context of our class. But we can actually do this inside our constructor as well. So inside our constructor, we could say sum func equals sum func.bind this. And now we have the same thing. We're now able to access this in context of our class. So that is kind of the other purpose of the constructor function, is to bind this to the functions that it's needed on inside our component. Now this is, again, another personal preference thing. I personally like this syntax because it's a lot easier than, it just looks a lot cleaner than something like that. Now we can keep our focus for our constructor on defining the initial state, the initial data for our application. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to, we're going to set up one more quick project that we're going to build and kind of talk about the rest of these lifecycle methods. So while I set that up, we'll take a quick little break. Just for, as a conclusion for what we talked about on the constructor, let's look at in Typekit here. Our conclusion for our constructor is that the constructor function on a React class component, the purpose of the constructor function is to serve up initial data for when the time comes to mount our DOM elements. Okay, so we have our constructor to set up our state. That is what we should be using our constructor for. Serve up initial state data for when the time comes to mount your DOM elements. Okay, awesome. Let's take a look at Slack, make sure we're good. Thank you. I was going very quickly. Cool. Let's take a quick break and we'll jump into our render method, and we'll start building out a little application using in the mindset of the lifecycle, a component lifecycle. We'll do 5 minutes, and I'll see you back then. All right. Come on back to your computers. And we'll keep talking about the circle of life. Oh, sorry, my microphone was way over there. Good thing too, because I'm not a great singer, so yeah. All right. We've got our life cycles. We've talked about the constructor function, and we've concluded that our constructor function is, the purpose of it is to serve up initial state data. So I have jumped into Code Sandbox, and I've forked this app that we built last week. Right? You guys remember this one? I will share this on our channel here. So you guys have a copy of the new one and know what we're going to, and can follow along here. Okay, so, hey, look at that. We've even got a cool note about our super. So let's take a quick note about our constructor. This is to serve up initial state data. Okay, this is a lifecycle method. So here we've set up our initial data. Now, what would happen if we wanted to have a default list on our initial data? Well, we would have to do that here. So if we always want these three to show up at the top, we have to set that up as part of our initial data. So that's what the constructor is for, setting up our state object. And you'll notice in our user list, we have, this is a functional component. This is a presentational component. This isn't a class component, right? We're not using the class syntax. We're not building a class. We're just building a function that's returning this JSX here. So inside a functional component, we don't have these lifecycle methods. We don't have access to the constructor. We don't have access to the render, but the rendering is still happening inside this function. We just don't have, we can't render it here. We can't do some JavaScript stuff here. Okay, we have to do things a little bit different since we don't have that render function in our functional component. So everything we're talking about today as far as lifecycle methods, if you need to use a lifecycle method, you have to build a class component. Okay, so we've got our constructor. Let's talk a little bit about this render function. Render function is cool. We like the render function. So the render function is when you build a class component, it is absolutely necessary to have a render function that returns something, some kind of JSX. You could just return null. That is, this is an accepted return out of a render function. Okay, you can return a single element. We could return an array of elements. So we could just do this all over again. Now you have it in there twice. Okay. These are all accepted returns from our render function. but we don't want to do that. So we'll just keep it with returning a single element here. Render should be a pure function. So it should always return the same thing if it's each time it's called, if it's given the same data into it. So keep that in mind. Render is a pure function. The concern, or render is concerned with what this dot props is and this dot state. So it's going to look at the data, this dot state data or this dot props data, and return some sort of DOM element, right? So the purpose of the render function is to look at the data that's available inside this function, inside this component, and then return some JSX element. And just as the name suggests, the key here to remember is that render is basically in charge of creating what we expect to see in the actual DOM after the whole reconciliation phase is finished. Okay, so the render function is there to tell us what our component is going to look like. How is this component going to render out on the actual DOM? Another thing that we can learn about render is that it spans both the mounting phase and the updating phase. So if we look at this chart here, you'll see that render runs both in the mounting phase and then runs when state or props is changed. So those are just a couple key things to remember about the render function. Pretty simple, just as the name implies. What are we rendering out of this component? What are we expecting to be rendered to the DOM? So if we look at this, we're expecting a user list and a user form. Now, with React, we are trying to be, we're trying to compose our React applications. If we're thinking in React again, I'm going to refer often back to that article. If we are thinking about composing our application as a bunch of pieces of smaller components, then thinking about it that way, if you come into a component that's already been coded, that someone else built, and you're trying to figure out what is happening inside this component, you can look down at the render function, as this is a very good first place to start when looking at a React component to figure out what is happening inside this component. So hopefully components have been written in such a way that it's easy to look at render and say, okay, what is going to be rendered in the DOM? We've got a user list, we've got a user form, and we're passing this data, these pieces of data, down to each of these components. So when you are writing your applications, if you look at a component and you look at render, the render function, and it's not very clear on, if the render function doesn't make it clear on what this component is supposed to be doing, then I would suggest that it could be maybe broken up into smaller components or refactored so that it's very easy to look at what this component is doing. So that is just something that I've learned from experience that I'm going to impart to you, piece of my hard-earned wisdom, is to look at the render function to get a good idea of what is going on inside a component. Same with functional components, just look at what's being returned to get an idea of what is the purpose of this component. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to jump into this code sandbox, and I want you to, we're going to do console.log, a couple console logs here to help us learn. We're going to move this up. And I'm going to set this up for you, and then I want you to kind of play around with things for a second. Actually, put this one down here. Okay, so refresh the page, open this up, and I want you to open up the console and see what is being printed out. And then I want you to kind of play around. This will take 20, 30 seconds. Just play around with adding some more users and seeing if anything new prints out in the console and when this prints out in the console. We'll do this a few times as we go through learning the rest of these component methods. So do that right now for about 30 seconds and just see when the constructor runs and if it runs again after we add new data. If we're changing state, is our constructor running again? Okay, hopefully you had a chance to do that. I'm going to refresh mine. All right, so we're printing out in constructor and our initial state, which has our users in there, because that's what we defined as our initial state. If I print something else out, then neither of these console logs is running again, right? Because remember, our constructor runs one time. Let's look at this one. Our constructor just runs one time when mounting. So when I press refresh here, that's the only time that we're actually going to run our constructor function. So updates do not trigger our constructor again. So let's go down and let's do the same thing for render. Let's console.log, and we'll say running render method. And then we'll say, what is the state of things? And we'll do this dot state. Okay, so same thing. I want you to, I'll save this, and I want you to jump on and look at the different console logs that are happening. I want you to add some data in here and see the new console logs that run and take a look at the state of things when you add more and more data. And actually, you'll notice, if you have the console open, notice what happens every time you type a single letter. Okay. play around with that, and we'll come back in about a minute. Okay, cool. So I'm going to open up Slack. We should real quick just fix that error. I apologize for that. Key is going to be user. Okay, next time we rerun it, we won't get that error anymore. All right, that's saved, so now you have that updated for you. What are some things you noticed? Talk to me here for a second. What did you notice as you, in the console, as you were typing and as you were adding data? Yep, it updates on every keystroke. Yeah, as we're typing, it's updating. Why is it updating on every single keystroke? Let's take a look at that happening. So I'm going to open my console and I'm going to lift it up high. I'm going to push A. Okay, we're running. I typed in A and we ran our render method. And our input text is now A. And then I click B and we run our render method again. So why is it that a single keystroke is causing this to happen? Who can tell me why that is happening? Ah, perfect. Because set state runs the render method. Yep. So if we look at where is this input? Let's go find our input. It's probably in our user form. So our input, when it's changing, is invoking our handle input function. So let's look for our handle input function. Here it is inside our class component, inside our index.js. And you'll notice that we're running this .setState every time we type. For every keystroke, we're running this .setState. Well, if we look at here, inside our updating phase, we've got setState. So every time setState is called, which in our application is every time we type a key, we're going to run the render function. So for every single key that's being typed, this function gets invoked, which means we're going to console log these. And you'll notice real quick that, well, it doesn't really go through it here. That's okay. You'll notice that as we type, we're console logging this .state. It's the updated state. So console log isn't running before, or the render function runs after our state gets updated. remember we talked about that set state is an async function, asynchronous code. So it's important to remember that render will wait for our state to actually be updated, so that when we click C, we get the latest state value. Okay, well, let's see. Set state, is it efficient from a performance standpoint to do that? Yeah, that is a great question. React is actually really good with forms. So let's say we had, let's do like sign up form templates. So let's look at something like, where's a big one? Like this. So let's look at this component here. This is a form with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different components, right? 11 different inputs. So anytime we type into any of these, if they're controlled components and updating state on every keystroke, then it's a really good point to be concerned about performance when we're trying to keep track of all these elements on the DOM, right? Luckily for us, React does a really good job of making this kind of a situation really performant. And because of the reconciliation process, where it knows which elements need to be updated, and the virtual DOM is keeping really good track of all of those different inputs and knows which one needs to be updated on the DOM, you usually don't run into a performance issue. Now, there are times that you do run into a performance issue. And so you have to, later on, as you could run into those situations, and you'll have to learn from that experience when you need to set things up a little bit differently. But for the most part, and especially to the point that we want you guys to be at by the end of this class, that's not something that you need to be worried about running into right now. So that's something a couple years down the line that I would expect, if I talk to you later, I'd expect to be able to talk to you about those different situations. So really good question. We're not, short answer is that it is efficient from a performance standpoint that this is happening. Adam asks, so every instance of set state calls render again? Yep, absolutely. If we look here, every time we run set state, we know that render is going to be invoked every single time. So it's not, in this project, it's not just on keystrokes. If we hit add user, then we're running the method again. And now our input text is now an empty string because we ran this function. So we set, inside our set state, we ran an empty string, or we set input text to empty string, and we added our new user. So instead of users being an array of 3, our users is now an array of 4. Let's watch this. This is kind of the same concept of what we saw last week. When, if we open up, oh, not Redux, we want React. If we open up our app and our users list and our user form, and then we start typing, let's go to app here. And we're going to watch our state change, and then we're going to watch input text here change, and probably our user list change. So every time you see this green pop up and you see new things here, that's because we're updating the state, and set state is going to run that render function over again. Now we just added a whole new user. So React tools are awesome. Get to see these changes happening in real time. Woo! It's fun to just to get behind, just to do this a little bit and watch behind the scenes what's happening. What is React doing with this cool application that I built? Like, I built this so that, you know, you can see these cool real-time updates happening, and you can see these console logs happening. If we look back at this and go to our console, so much is happening. It's so cool. So this is, I like doing these kind of exercises. I think they're pretty helpful for learning, you know, what is React doing underneath the hood on all of these things. We don't need some of these from our last. Okay. All right, any thoughts or questions about render before we move on? The Owl of Knowledge. So I'm going to, inside here, I'm going to leave us a quick note about render. It says, we'll say render's concern is to look at this dot props. Obviously this component doesn't have props, but you'll have child components that are class components that have this dot props. So render's concern is to look at this dot props and this dot state and return some sort of DOM element. So this is a perfect use case for this. We're looking at this render function is constantly looking at this dot state, right? This dot state dot input text, and then rendering that to the DOM. And then remember, our constructor is concerned with serving up our initial state data. Okay, these are the two that you will use always. Constructor and render. There is some cool advanced ES6 stuff you can do to not type out the actual constructor function and instead set your state as a property on the class itself. But until we really understand what this is doing, I want you guys to be typing out the constructor function always. And then sometime soon we'll look at the other way to do it that's a little bit more concise. Okay, any last questions on constructor or render? All right, we are going to build a quick little application. It comes out of TK. It's going to be this challenge right here. So we're going to build an application of doggies, a doggy application, doggo, a doggo application, okay? And while we're doing that, we're going to learn this last objective, component did mount. We learn about the component did mount function. And then that finishes our objectives for today. I do want to just mention that we have this last component did update function that we're not going to use right now, and we may not get to it in the React unit. So this will be a good one for you to kind of research a little bit on your own. The most important ones, constructor and render and component did mount, are what what you need to have a good working knowledge of when you leave this React unit. So I do want to note that there is this one out there that you can start researching and learning about. Okay, so let's do this. Let's build our doggo app. Don't leave that. Let's save it. Okay, we're going to open up a new sandbox. All right, right off the bat, we want to change app to a class. If you want to follow along, I'll give you a second to open up your own code sandbox. If you want to build this alongside with me, I think that would be really good practice for everybody. And we'll stop every once in a while and I'll give you a chance to code ahead of me and see if you can put what we're learning into practice. So take a second to, while I get this set up as a class, to open up a new code sandbox and turn this component into a class component. Implements. This is Angular. What am I doing Angular? Blah. Extends. Okay, so I'll give you about 2 minutes to open up your new sandbox and catch up with me here. All right, I didn't set a timer, so hopefully that was 2 minutes. I don't know. If you're not quite there, I will post this and you can just fork it and start from here. Okay. And you can also use this link as a reference for the final app when we're done. All right, so we want to add a constructor to this class. And inside the constructor, build initial state with a doggos property, which is going to be an empty array. Okay, so take a minute to do that. You're going to add a constructor, and you're going to set this dot state to build our initial state. And on this dot state, we're going to have a doggos property that's set to an empty array. And yeah, give you just a minute to do that. If you're not finished, that's okay. Keep finishing. I'm just going to be doing that myself. I'm going to call super and set up our state object with doggos. That's going to be an empty array. Cool. So we have accomplished the purpose of our constructor by setting up our initial state for our application. All right, perfect. The next thing we want to do is let's build a component. So let's build a new directory inside our source called components. So make sure you're doing this alongside me, and then create a file called doggos.js. All right, and then take a minute to just set up a really simple functional component here. So import I'll set it up quickly, and then I'll give you a couple minutes to finish setting yours up as well. All right, so by the time you're done, you should be able to import doggos and display whatever you have in doggos here inside your app. So I'll give you just a minute to get to that point. Okay, so we've got our doggos here. So we're using our render method and our constructor method. We could do similar tests on console.log to see when everything is running, but I think we've got a pretty good handle on that. We may come back to that because we're going to add one more component lifecycle in just a minute. So let's see. Let's go ahead and take our last break, 5-minute break, and we'll come out and we'll build the rest. We'll come back and build the rest of our Doggos app. I'll save this in case, for whatever reason, you had something break and you need a good reference point to start from. So if you need that, jump on and fork my sandbox from Slack. Okay, I'll see you guys in just a couple minutes. All right, come on back to your computers and we'll get this finished up. So far we're at a point that we have our constructor and render method set up, and we're displaying doggos. Let's jump into doggos real quick, and let's do doggos. Oh, if we need to add a dependency of prop types because we want to prop type our things. So add your dependency of prop types, import that into your doggos component like this. And then we're going to just set an empty prop type object. Like that. Okay, we haven't used this yet because that comes once we add props here. Okay, so add your dependency prop types, spelled with kebab case, and then import prop types from there and add an empty prop types object to the doggos.proptypes, not capitalized. All right. So let's go to our index, and we're going to talk about our last lifecycle function, lifecycle method that we want to talk about for this lesson. And that is component did mount. Now the component did mount function sets a component state post render. So let's find our handy dandy guide here, and we see component did mount down here at the bottom of the mounting phase. So our component mounts, our constructor runs, our render function runs, and after our render and constructor functions run, then if we have a component did mount function in our class, that will run. Now, what's the point of that? Why is it important that we run render first and then component did mount afterwards? The reason for that is that we have to understand the timing of component did mount to know why this is important. So it gets called as soon as the render method is called the first time. And I really like this thought here. It says, it's kind of like this. Our component has mounted. We have the bare bones minimum we need to put something on the screen. Now what? So we've rendered something on the screen. It's the bare bones stuff because that's what our constructor is for, right? What is the initial data? So it's rendered our initial data. Oh, let's just close that guy out. It's rendered our initial data. So now what? Well, let's take a look. So we're going to use component did mount, and it's a function like this. So just like your constructor, just like your render, we just have a function, this syntax like this. So type that in, component did mount, and then let's look at what this is for. So inside of component did mount, we can actually call set state. So in our constructor, we're going to set up our initial state, and then in our component did mount, we're going to update our state with new state. For example, maybe there's something we need to get. Maybe there's some data for this application, for this component that we need to get asynchronously, like from a server. So component did mount is where we can run an asynchronous data fetch. And once that data comes back, then we can run this.setState and re-render our component with our new data that just returned. Okay, so that was a lot. What does that actually look like? Let's see if there's anything else right here. Okay, so we can actually call setState, which will force a re-render of our component. This means that any asynchronous actions should be performed inside of our component and mount. So I want to reiterate that. If you have any asynchronous actions, then it should be performed inside component did mount, especially when it comes to fetching data via HTTP. This is the de facto purpose for component did mount. Okay, this is an important paragraph right here. All right, because this describes perfectly why we use component did mount. So let's take a look at it in code. I'm going to do a cool ES6 thing here, and I'm going to use the fetch keyword. We're going to pass in this string here. Don't worry about following along with me at this point. We haven't learned how to do this. So the workings of this is not important right now. And I'll copy and paste this code for you in just a second. In fact, this. And this is stuff we haven't learned, which we will learn in the near future. So don't worry too much about what's going on right here. I'll explain it in just a second. Okay. So what this is doing is it is making an actual API call to a server right here. So this is a live server, and we are fetching data from this live server through the interwebs. And then we're changing what that returns. We're changing the data that we get back from that into something that we can read. And then we're taking that data that we formatted into something we can read, and we are setting our state with that data. So don't worry too much about this. If you want to look into this on your own and figure out how it's working, then you'll be a step ahead of what we're going to be doing next week. But I'll post, or I'll paste this whole component did mount right here. Fetch. Wait, I get it. That was a good one. Actually, I'll just do it like this. Discard. Okay, there you go. You've got component did mount with all the fetch stuff happening. Okay, again, don't worry too much about this syntax. Just know that what is happening is we are asynchronously fetching some data from this server, and then we are going to update our state. We're going to run this.setState with that data that we're getting back. So at this point, I'm going to save everything there. At this point, let's play our console log game again. So make sure you have component did mount in your files, and then under super console.log constructor running. Okay, so do a quick console log. You can name whatever these strings are to help you understand that you're inside the constructor and that the constructor has fired off. Highlight that and copy it, so we can just copy and paste. Okay, let's do above our fetch, we're going to do console.log component did mount, CDM, component did mount. I'm going to do something like inside component did mount. Okay. Then inside our render, I'm going to say something like hello from render. And let's look at this dot state again. Okay, so add those 3 console logs. We'll take away this line here. And you can see all the console logs here, so catch your app up with mine, and then watch the console logs as you save that. Okay, so let's take a look at this. As we mount our component by refreshing the page, we first get our constructor running. Okay, then we get a hello from render, and we can see that we don't have any doggos. No doggos. That's because we haven't run our component did mount. This is the first render. Then our component did mount runs, ba-da-ding. And then once that runs, since we're running set state with the data, it re-renders the component. So our component re-renders. Hello from render. And we get an array of doggos. And you can see it's just an array of URLs. So pretty cool. This follows exactly what we've learned. The constructor fires off, render fires off with our blank array, with our empty array, right? No doggos. Then we use component did mount to fetch some data asynchronously. And when that data comes back, it runs this dot set state, which runs render one more time with the new state, with our new doggos. So I also want to do one thing. Let's pass in as an array. We'll pass in our doggos, this dot state doggos, to our doggos. So we've got doggos on here, and we know it is of the prop type, types dot array of, because you don't just type array, we want to tell the story of this component, an array of strings. And then we're going to map over, we'll make a UL, and we'll map over our array. Oh, do it inside braces. Props dot doggos dot map, and we're going to pass a doggo. And for every doggo, we're going to output an LI. Don't worry, I'll give you a second to catch your app up with this. Boom. Okay, don't look yet. So catch up with me. The changes we've made are that we're passing, now that we have doggos in our state, we're passing doggos down as a prop to our doggos component, and we're type checking that with prop types, and building out this UL list. Okay, so catch up with me, and then we'll do one last thing before we look at we'll look at this for one quick second before we look into our project for today. Okay, so hopefully you're at this point. I did save my project, so you can fork it at this point if you got stuck somewhere. But what I want to do is inside this doggos function here, let's console log one more time. And let's just say rendering doggos component. And it looks like I have a question here. Oh, screen share is gone. There we go. Thank you, guys. Sync in Zoom. I don't know what happened. Okay. So should be at this point. Let's see, how long ago was that? Okay, just barely. Good. So you should be at this point. Inside doggos, what I did is I just console logged, ran a console log, rendering doggos component. Just so we can see how often doggos is being rendered here. So we've got our unordered list that's kicking out a li list item, which is an image for every doggo. And we're going to see in our console what is being run. Oh, I wonder if there might be duplicate images where that's why we're getting a unique key prop error. That's okay. I'm not concerned about that for this example. So let's look at this. We're going to refresh, and we get our constructors running, and then our first render happens, which means that doggos is going to render, right? So we have our first constructor, our first render with 0 doggos, and we're rendering our doggos component. Then we hit our component did mount, and that runs, and our render function runs again, which means our doggos is going to render again, and we're now rendering doggos component. So there we go. That is a really good look at probably 80% of the components you'll ever build, the life cycle of 80+% of the components you'll ever build. Constructor, fetch some data asynchronously, run this.setState, and when this.setState updates, whether it's from this fetch call or from a form where you're typing into it, render is going to be reinvoked. And of course, let's take a second to look at these cute dogs. Oh, that's my favorite one. That's a cute pup. Awesome. So you've got this for reference. Let's take a look at, if there's no other questions on the component lifecycle, on the circle of life, then let's take a look at the project. Yeah, we can do this as Carlos is mentioning. That's awesome. So real quick, we can use the index as a key. This can be a little bit dangerous. You have to know when not to use index as a key. Again, that's a good research topic that you can look into. But in this instance, we would kind of have to use it because we've got some duplicate images. What's cool though, just a side note, is you'll notice that there's no duplicate images in our list here. That's because, let's say this white puppy was a duplicate image. React, since it is duplicated, the key is duplicated, actually removed the second instance of that picture. So it doesn't let you add items with duplicate keys. It removes one of those items. Okay, good point. Thank you, Carlos. All right, let's take a look at the project for today. So we are continuing, let's see, here we go. We're continuing our InstaClone project. You should be, by this point, you should be up to something about that looks about-ish like this. And this is the point that we want to start at today. So remember, this is a week-long project. We're going to be building this up each day. So it's important at the end of each day to get your app to a good working point so you can, even if you don't finish the MVP, make sure your app is working, and so you're ready to work on it tomorrow. Okay, so let's look at day 2. So day 2, the focus is to understand the concept of React component lifecycles, such as render, component did mount, and the constructor. Our setup is that we should have a working component, a working app with a component tree that looks something like this. So you're going to have your container application in the purple or blue, and then you've got a component that is a search bar at the top, and then you've got a post container, which looks like it's repeating for each post inside the application. And inside each instance of post container, you've got a comment section, you've got an image inside here, you've got the actual post, you've got the comment section, etc. So this is kind of the component tree that we are looking for at this point. Okay, so your data should be imported to app.js, then passed to each post container. And then each post container should be passing that data to the comment section. So you have all your data stored in app.js, and you're now passing via props the correct data down to the correct components. All right, so one thing you're going to have to, or this is still in the setup. So this is where we should be at. This is where you should be starting from. The props being passed should be type checked using prop types and default props. And then the component section should add a comment to the post. So that's our daily setup for, this is the starting point for today. So today's project will be using React's lifecycle methods to get data and render the components. And then use functions passed as props to build out the functionality a little bit more. And then we're going to, as the data comes to a component, you'll set the component state and pass it down to child components. let's see, we'll add the functionality to add a comment to any of the posts. So correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that this should be working today. Is that right? So we shouldn't have adding a comment. That's part of today's project. Is that correct? You guys let me know if this was, I think this is what we're going to be doing today and not it was a stretch from day one. Okay, cool. So stretch from day one, you may have this working, but we want to add the functionality today to add a comment. Since we don't have a login page or anything like that, hard code a static username. And then we're going to implement the ability to like a post by clicking on the heart icon, and then get the search bar to filter posts by the post's username. So today, the tasks, to get to our MVP, you have to complete these tasks. First, refactor your component to use the correct lifecycle methods. So in app.js, I know we're importing static data, so we're not actually doing an asynchronous call, but I'd like you to use component.did.mount and this.setState to get that data that you're importing onto the state object. So instead of, so your state should be, if you have posts, set up your state with an empty array and then use component.did.mount to add the data that you're importing to state. Let's see, let's get back to, there we go. So we're going to use component.did.mount for that. Sorry, this is probably pretty small. All right, then you're going to add components, and it talks about how to do that here. And then we have the task to be able to like posts and to implement the search. So this is all, these are all things you know how to do with what we've learned from last week and today. So this will be the MVP for today, and then a couple stretch problems for the day here. So persist your data using localhost. Tomorrow we'll actually be implementing a little bit of localhost, but not necessarily for this data, more for like a login type situation. Add the ability to delete a comment from your data. And if you implemented localhost, make sure to delete it from there as well. And then finally, last stretch, implement a third-party library that does fuzzy searches into your search bar functionality. And it gives a quick explanation of that. Okay, so I will post this README to our channel. And again, you don't have to fork and clone anything down. You're just working off the same InstaClone project that you started on Friday. Since we had the 3-day weekend and you were starting the InstaClone project on your own, please reach out to your project manager ASAP, first thing this morning or this afternoon, if you are not at a good point to start today's tasks. So if you're not, forget this last bullet point, if you're not at this point right now with your app, then please reach out to your project manager and we can help you get to the point that you need to be to start today's work. Okay, cool. If you guys have any questions, reach out to us, and enjoy the circle of life of your components, your life cycle, your React component life cycles. Don't forget to use prop types to check types and protect your app a little bit more. and we will see you tomorrow for some higher order components. Have a great day, guys.